Scaling your applications is hard. It might seem like web apps are easy to scale, but in a lot of ways, they're harder. Both the technical aspect of making your application reach millions of users in a performant way, but also just scaling your team and helping it grow and continue to iterate. You can probably guess that Vercel thinks a lot about this. Specifically, Vercel's CTO thinks a lot about this. He just did a talk that I haven't had a chance to watch yet, and I'm really excited about it. So let's take a look and see what he has to say about scaling your applications. I'm sure we're all going to learn a lot from it. Yeah. We love Codex. We love MUI and AG Grid. All good people. That's a big set of sponsors. Appflow is the one I'm covering up slightly. And Malta, Principles for Scaling Front-End Application Development. I'm guessing it's going to focus more on the dev side, but I'm curious to hear if that is the case or not.
How's everyone doing? Yeah, thanks for talking about JSConf and stuff. We made the wise decision not to have a 2010 event because it wouldn't have happened anyway. And this is actually my first conference, at least if you counting community conferences, back from this bigger break in everyone's life. Yeah, I'm coming from San Francisco. I was actually in Germany before. Still a little bit jet lagged, but I'm trying to bring up the vibes here a little bit. Yeah, so in this sense of reminiscing a little bit, 5 years ago at JSConf Australia, I gave a talk, and I started with this sentence: "Hello, I used to build very large JavaScript applications." I was still at Google at the time, and I was stepping into kind of an executive role. So I wasn't really actually building stuff myself, but I learned some stuff. And so I thought it would be a good idea to give a talk about it. But that was then. I'm back. I'm actually back to building things in JavaScript. The very large applications. Obviously, nobody today actually does that anymore. It's TypeScript applications. And here we are.
Good call out. Not enough people make this particular call out. Malta is one of the harder moves over to TypeScript land. Going from core Chrome team over to actually scaling your applications land was a huge transition. I think he made the jump really well.
Another slide from that talk was that I thought React was good. And the context there was that back in the day, 10 years ago, I built a JavaScript framework at Google called Wiz. And I was thinking about whether to open source it. And so just around that time, React comes out, and it looks really good. And I think the world does not need this. I'm going to keep this to ourselves. I think now that it was a bit of a mistake because there were some good contributions around scalability of applications that could have been actually valuable to the ecosystem, even if just kind of shown around. But now I'm at Vercel, I can kind of help a little bit, push React along, and I think with the stuff around server components, etc., some of this situation that we thought about at Google back in the day, has come around and is now available to everyone, which is amazing. Cool. All right. So I joined Vercel. I talked to all the teams, and I find that we have an internal DX team. And so I talked to them, what are you guys doing? They explained to me what they're doing. I think that seems like a really good idea.
My prediction for what he's going to say here, I've never had this convo with him or anything. My guess is every team's a DX team. Every team should be thinking about DX. Let's see what he says.
And then I go talk to customers. And our customers are telling me that their problems are the problems that our internal DX team is solving. And so I was like, why don't we turn this into a product team and actually make this available to everyone so that not everyone has to go over and over again, solve the same problems. Now,
DX is a huge part of the product. This is an interesting framing. I'm excited to see where it goes. I saw somebody asking what DX is. DX stands for developer experience. It's a generic term for how developers use a thing and the experience that they have using it. It's kind of like UX for developers.
This is in a way relevant because the talk I gave back in the day, it was so such theory heavy stuff because I didn't have anything open source. I could only tell folks this is what I learned, but you have to figure out how to take this learning into something real by yourself. Now, I'm going to be doing similar stuff today, and more power to you if you want to build yourself. We did announce a product called Vercel Spaces a few weeks ago that's trying to implement some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in a reusable fashion. All right, so let's go ship software like Google or Vercel, because it's 2023. But kind of going to Google, there was this guy called Eric Schmidt. He was the CEO for a long time. And he, at least
classic Eric quote,
internally, maybe I'm leaking something, sorry, always used to say, revenue solves all known problems. Basically saying, if you just make more money, it really doesn't matter what else you're doing. And I think that's wrong. Certainly we don't have infinite money. You don't have infinite money. I think Google no longer has infinite money. So that's not really, it's just not such a good mantra. But I think
the zero interest rate phenomena are dying.
this one is actually true. Iteration velocity solves all known problems. What I mean is that when we
hard agree. And this is why I push almost everything I push. It doesn't matter how legit your service is. You cannot predict the unpredictable. And being able to iterate quickly around the unpredictable is what makes you the most effective. Like giant air freight carriers are really good at, once a course is set, getting a bunch of airplanes from one place to another. But if you have to change course at any point in that journey, it takes one of those things like a day to turn. So if you're not on an exact course you've planned years ahead, you're fucked. And that's what makes these new tools so powerful. It's not just like, oh, small teams can move really fast. It's every team can move really fast. Every team can change things really effectively. And that's how you solve real problems. It's not just like big companies are different. Big companies also have problems they need to solve. They also have expectations change, products that fail, products that succeed more than they expected. And being able to iterate quickly on that is so essential. I'll let you talk, Malte.
Make software, and that was actually the first talk today had a similar point. We are going to make mistakes over time, right? That's the only thing that we know, is that the future is uncertain, and we have to deal with that fact professionally. And the way how you do that professionally is by being able, at the moment when you make that mistake, to react to it and iterate and do it right the second time around. So with that, right, let's think a little bit about our role in this and for the rest of this talk. So the senior engineer, or really what I mean is like the lowercase c engineer, right? We've been around for a little bit. What do, right? You might have, there's a session later today.
I like the term lowercase senior engineer, of just someone who's been around too long. I think I might not actually fit within this definition because I'm still younger.
Today around career advice. And they might tell you something like, if you want to have more impact, you need to scale beyond yourself. And what people kind of usually associate with this is something along the lines of kind of either having management responsibility or at least telling other folks what to do. So it's a people thing, right? And so the rest of this talk is kind of about something very different from that. It's about how you can scale beyond yourselves, but through software that you build and through mechanisms that you establish in your teams that make that whole team better, but through the software that you're building. And so for the rest of these slides, basically consider yourselves as like the hypothetical lead of the hypothetical platform team for your hypothetical, 12, 50, 100-person engineering team, right? You're that person, and your job is to make that team scale better. Cool.
Been there.
That was a long intro. Anyway, I want to talk about principles for scaling front-end applications. I got 6. I have a bonus one, but I think I'm too slow, so I'll do 6. All right, so let's start with this one, tearing down the barriers. So this is actually something that was not clear to me how big of an effect it would have. As I was mentioning, I was like at Google for the longest time. I was not like using the tools everyone else was using, but I was, doing this conference, JSConf. I was going to these meetups myself, and I would hear folks on stage being incredibly excited about small modules, right? And there was a company called NPM, shout out NPM, who created something called private modules. And so people would go and in their company share code through publishing modules to NPM. And so I'm joining Vercel and I see that happening where like some team says, well, you have some cool code. Can you like publish that to NPM so I can use it? And then I have to update my package JSON to your new version. Maybe someone's helping me. Maybe I'm doing this automatically. That's such an incredibly bad process. And at scale, if you have a larger team, it really hurts. Right? So my one kind of weird trick advice, if you haven't done it yet and you want to get that adrenaline shot in the arm, go migrate to a monorepo. Like it's really worth it.
Having went from like Twitch scale to startup land, and then taking what I learned in startup land and applying it at like Twitch scale companies I help out, it's not just a things get done faster, it's an energy thing. I have a video about engineering leadership, and I talk about this a lot in it. Giving your team what they need to engage with and like build their energy and excitement around stuff is so important. And a big part of what tearing these barriers down is it lets you go from that moment of excitement to the thing is shipped much more effectively. If I have an idea for something that solves our problem, it makes our service way cheaper, it makes this feature our users will love, but I have 15 busy work steps from when I have the idea to when it gets deployed, I've lost so much of my energy and excitement by the time I'm actually solving the problem. Excitedly thinking of something to excitedly releasing that thing, it's just so much better. I saw people saying that like they're losing track of the topic because they love how Malte is talking so much. This is just how he speaks. Like I chat with him a decent bit in person all the time, and he's very thoughtful and thorough. And it's really cool seeing somebody go from like the Google way of doing things to the as deep as you get in startup land, being the CTO of Vercel, and recognizing how much value there is in these ways of doing things. Really excited for this.
Now, obviously it comes with trade-off. Everything in software engineering comes with trade-off. Few months in, you'll notice, oh, like everyone can change everything. Maybe that isn't the best idea on the planet, right? But it's good to have a basis that encourages and puts a low barrier on collaboration, and you can deal with the problems that kind of come along the way. And there's certain scalability problems that, for example, GitHub Code Owners addresses. Now, that's kind of a weirdly not very great product among the other stuff at GitHub that's really good. So as part of our Spaces product, we're actually shipping something called Owners.
Of course, he plugs Spaces. He's been working really hard on that stuff. It's super cool. And like, I understand his frustrations with code owners, but the tools around this type of work need to get better still. But he is working hard to do that.
Which is basically like code owners, but like good. So check it out. All right, for the second principle, I'm calling this making it easy to delete code. Because there's one true thing about any large code base is that it will get larger. And that's in a way good, right? Like, it's our job to write code. We're going to write code. There's nothing you can do about it. But we can, again, as the platform lead, professionally manage and encourage our engineers to have as little code as possible, and that includes deleting code. Now, if we, all think about...
There's a bunch of weird edges to this one too. I'm not sure if he mentions this or not, but like, this is why I hate code coverage, because code coverage often makes it really hard to delete code. Because if you have like an 80% threshold in your code base of code cov, you're just barely hitting it. And you have this giant old feature that no one's using anymore that you want to deprecate. You've already hidden it. You just want to delete the code. But deleting it drops you under that code cov line. Now that code's just going to sit there. And that's what happens almost every time, is the PR doesn't get merged, and you end up with all of these giant piles of stale code and no one even remembering why it's there, if it's being used. Everything you can do to make code deletable is worth it, because engineers like to delete code. It feels good to have a PR that's more negative than positive with a line count. Do what you can to make that more accessible for your teams.
About our code bases, there's probably something like this in there, right? There's some code that pretty obviously should not be there. 2017, whatever.
That's hilarious.
And maybe that was originally a React component, and we got rid of that React component, right? But we had a CSS file that was also contributing to our 2017 Happy New Year message, and who knows whether that selector can be deleted, right? That's really like almost a halting problem type of problem, and so it kind of lingers around. Now, on the other hand, if you're using something like Tailwind or CSS like NJS libraries, because you have co-location of the CSS with the code, you can just delete the whole thing with high confidence, get rid of it. And again, like, this is the type of thinking you should have as the lead, to say like, that's why I'm making this choice of using something like Tailwind, because it actually makes it easier to delete code.
That's a huge argument. I don't actually make enough for Tailwind. One of the benefits of not having to name everything and create classes and CSS files and a style system and relationships with all this is that it becomes much more deletable. That's a really good point, and I'm going to push that more in the future when I plug Tailwind. Look at that, already learning things from Malte. What a surprise.
As another good example of this type of thinking, I think is data fetching inside of components in Next.js 13. So in this example, we have a tweet component, right? And we only pass the ID. The tweet component fetches its own data. Now, if we delete that tweet component, everything's gone. Remember how this worked in like legacy Next.js or something like Remix loaders?
Where you suddenly start fetching things in your get server-side props and block the whole page load until it's done loading, and then you stop using that feature, but you forget to take it out of get server-side props because it causes some type error or something somewhere, and now you're blocking every single page request ever on a feature that's been deprecated for a year. Yeah, I'm familiar.
Data fetching is hoisted to the top of the route. So if I delete something that's very far down my React render tree, I have to remember to also delete the data fetching code. And if you have a large team, someone will forget some of the time. And it'll not only make your application kind of larger and have unnecessary stuff in it, but it will also make it substantially slower, or in the case of data fetching, even like introduce cost, because you're calling some backend system that you really don't have to call. So again, it's kind of the same idea of CSS and JS, it's just for data fetching in JS. And I know some folks like say, well, that doesn't scale, blah, blah, blah.
So I saw somebody in chat say, accept, defer, and suspense solve this problem. Yeah, you can solve any problem by adding more things. The point is, this is about deleting things. If you have to add more things ahead of time to make stuff deletable later on, that defeats the purpose, because people are going to do the easiest thing. The reason server components are so magical, they make the default, which is the easy thing, really good. The thing that we will do by default, even just prototyping, is not just good enough for production. It's one of the best production experiences. And when a thing gets slow, you can wrap that thing with suspense. But the value here isn't that it's introducing stuff that was impossible before. It is doing that too, but the value is primarily how easy it makes it to have a component that fetches the right data. Relay solved that problem too if you've successfully architected your entire Relay backend to have all of the data you ever need ever. But if I need to fetch something from another service, you're fucked. You have to go define a new schema endpoint, a new resolver, a new update to your GraphQL schema, get your backend team to approve it, and now maybe you can finally start working on it. Or with server components, you just await the thing you want to do on your backend. It is groundbreakingly different. Anyways.
Like one of my, I think, accomplishments at Google that I'm most proud of was introducing exactly this. And so any larger Google app that you've been using over like the last 8 or so years is using exactly this technique, where you have data fetching in the render tree as opposed to data fetching in some like hoisted, pseudo scalable fashion. All right, principle number 3, always migrate incrementally.
That's such a banger tweet. I don't know if I saw that one before. It's so good. If y'all aren't already following Malta, fix that. He posts nothing but bangers.
Joking on Twitter the other day that there's basically just 2 types of migrations. There's the incremental ones and there's the failed ones. Now sometimes you start out with this big plan and you're going to say like, we're going to do this all at once. But I think more often than not, maybe you're like 3 months in and your boss comes and says, this is all fine and good, but we can't wait 6 more months to prove that this is going to work. I need to ship something next week or next month, right? And so something that started out as potentially, big bang type of migration typically eventually starts to become something that you do incrementally. And so it's ideally better to just plan it from the start. As just an example for the type of thinking that goes into API design to make it incremental migration possible, I think another good example is once again the Next.js 13 app router, where you can go and migrate a single route at a time, lift and shifting it into the new world, right? So no one's forcing you to say old API or new API. You can have that page on this API, this page on that API.
Just one silly example of this. We tried using server actions for upload thing and they weren't ready for a bunch of the random stuff we were doing. TRPC was. So we have one pages route in our app router project that started as an app router project for upload thing. We have the one pages/API just to serve TRPC through it. So we still have this one thing that we have this old method that we're used to. We threw that in pages. Everything else is in Apter. And not only can we incrementally migrate to Apter, we actually do the opposite. We can incrementally fall back on the old things that we know, rely on, and trust, and incrementally move off of it as the new pieces get ready. That back and forth potential here is something I've never had in any framework, where I can easily start something in the future and move to the past, or take something from the past and incrementally move parts to the future. That's a new thing. And I think Next did it really well here.
And kind of work you through the code base. And even further down in that project, here we have like some get server-side props, legacy shouldn't I say legacy? I don't know, whatever, old API, right? Which you perfectly fine still to use.
I'll say the thing he isn't saying, which is bad API. Get server-side props was terrible. I have a bit of content on it, but it was so bad, so bad.
But that's how it looked, and then you can do the first migration step. And note that this is like a trivial migration, right? Nothing really changed. We just took that code that was in get server-side props and put it into our top-level component. Now, is that better than before? No, it's not. Right? But it's an incremental step where you didn't have to rewrite your entire render tree to take advantage of some of the new capabilities. And again, just an example for how to make APIs that you can be migrated in this step-by-step fashion rather than doing everything at once. And obviously, shout out to the Next.js team who actually did a good job at this, I think. Cool. Moving on to principle number 4. Which is always getting better and never getting worse. This is actually, in a way, kind of related to the topic of incremental migration, but a little bit more general. So one good example for how you ensure that your application kind of has a certain standard would be by introducing lint rules, right? Which say, in my app, you have to do it this way, not the other way. Now, what happens sometimes, which isn't so great, something like this, which, by the way, I just randomly copy-pasted from Vercel's internal super secret code base, so I'm sorry if anything interesting is in there. The actually interesting parts are the comments, which basically disable lint rules all over the place, right?
I've seen this too many times in too many places. Just a shitload of disables. No default export. It's really funny they have that on. It's really funny Vercel has no default export on when so much of Next.js relies on default exports. That's hilarious.
Right. And actually, I think that's good. I'll talk about why this is the right way to do it. But obviously, it sucks to litter your code base with these comments, which add no value, right? But in a way, these comments are now this ledger of technical debt, right? Technical debt usually is this super abstract thing. But here you have a list, a to-do list of things you want to fix. Now, again, this kind of is nasty to your code base, which is why for our Spaces product, what we're using are these external kind of allow lists that don't litter your code base. You basically have a JSON file that says, there's some rules here, and in this file, it's okay to violate the rules.
This I am 50-50 on. I really like that. Axios rule slaps. That's hilarious. I actually really like that the files show what rules they're violating and encode it. I don't like that there's no ownership through that path. But what I do really like is the nature of how, when I'm reading that file, I have to know the context of this thing that I might not have seen in the rest of the code base. Like if we have no default exports on, and I'm in a file and it has a default export, my initial reaction, if there's no comment, is what the fuck is this? I might not even know about this Spaces rule configuration thing that Vercel has. And I'm really confused why this file is allowing it and others aren't. That to me is the value I see mostly from having that level of control in the code. If that was to be combined with this, that would be cool. Or at the very least, your editor has tools built in to highlight which rules are applying to which files, and maybe even a different color of underline. It's this is breaking the rules, but we're allowing it here. But this is going to need a lot of tooling to make it a good experience for developers. In moving this info out of the code file, although it benefits our ability to enforce it, it hurts our ability to understand it. And that's my concern.
Now, coming back to kind of the theme of getting better, not getting worse, what you really want to see for your team's code base is a graph like this. These violations over time. And you want to kind of let this come down over time. And then you see these steps up. That's actually not bad. That's when you introduce a new rule, right? And you allow this all existing violations, and then as this code actually gets touched, it gets better over time. And I want to encourage everyone to allow list this stuff, right? It's not actually important to migrate everything and put it into the new state. The reason is that, and this is actually something that wasn't obvious to me early in my career at all, that if you have something like some rule over your app, the marginal value of that rule is drastically higher on new code than it is on the old code. Because your old code is battle tested. It went through QA, it went through production outages, right? It went through users having creative ideas about what a name is. Like, you fixed all these things already, right? And so you likely actually won't find anything interesting. The reason why these rules exist is that when you write something new, at that moment, it tells you right away, hey, you're making a mistake, go fix it now, right? Where it's also really cheap to do it.
That's actually a really good point I don't think about enough. The like, where is the value in these things? I push it a bit when it comes to like migrations or building stuff with my tools. I don't think you should go rebuild your Create React app in Create T3 app, but I think if you're working on a lot of new features, maybe an incremental migration or a way to greenfield parts of it on a better stack is something you should absolutely consider. But the battle-tested nature of old code that users are using every day is something that's hard to replicate with tooling. And the benefit of tooling is creating code that will go off to be battle-tested, not for replacing code that already is, if that makes sense. I really like the points that Malte is making here.
And so that's why it's so important to quickly get these opinions into your code base for future code. And it's not important to now take out, a month out of your life to migrate everything you already have to the new state. So I talked a little bit about, like, in the abstract fashion about rules like this, and I gave this lint rule example. But actually, think, I want to talk about something slightly higher level than the lint rule, which is kind of associated with code style and stuff like this. So, but coming to the principle, embrace lack of knowledge. Again, you're the lead of this like larger team. There's going to be people who are new to your team. There's going to be people who are more junior. They're going to have, some context about that code base that they're lacking, that they can't know, or that they missed, or where they didn't read the memo, right? This all happens. And we as leaders of that team, we have to embrace that they might not have that context.
I push this one really hard. A thing I talk a lot about is my dumb questions rule. I think it's important to basically enforce people ask questions that feel stupid all of the time, because it makes knowledge gaps at the company way clearer. It makes the stress of asking a question way lower, helps new people get onboarded faster. It helps obvious things get discovered quicker. It's so important to encourage and allow for dumb questions to be asked. And I see that as part of embracing the lack of knowledge. Like everyone is stupid in a lot of ways, not in like the sense that they're bad at things, just that they don't have the information they need to do it right yet. And embracing that and building systems to push through and around that is so important.
And so that's why it's important to try to encode as many of these things that you know about your code base in some machine readable fashion. I have an example here of what that means. And again, goes way beyond like linting, but more into like application design opinions. This is a rule, again, like taken from Vercel's internal code base. And so we use Next.js middleware, and which is a very powerful tool, right? It runs on almost all requests we're serving. And that means if our middleware is slow, our site's going to be very slow, right? And one way how you can make your middleware really slow is by fetching something from some other service, right? On the other hand, fetching something from some other service might be exactly what you want to do, right?
Somebody mentioned in chat that some companies have a juniors have to ask one question per day rule. There's a high chance they got that from me. I've been pushing this for a while. I call it the dumb question rule. And I don't make it one, I make it three. 3 dumb questions a day for your first 2 weeks of the company, ideally at least 1 a day from that point forward. But usually what I found is when you've enforced it for their first few days, that's enough to create the culture where the employee's comfortable asking stupid things. And one of the best things you can do as a manager is ask dumb questions yourself. Just like the amount of times I embarrass myself in like company group chats because I ask something really obvious and stupid is hilarious. And sometimes we end up finding something really clever because my dumb question led us to realizing we overcomplicated something. So yeah, encouraging dumb questions on all sides is super important. It's cool to see more companies embracing the need for new employees in particular to ask more questions. Is 3 per day for a month weird? No, go for it.
Right? Because that's how you do interesting things, like you call services. Now, which means that, yes, you sometimes have to call a service, but no, sometimes it's not the right idea, right? And so with an allow list mechanism like this, what you can do is you can say, by default, making this change requires approval by someone who actually has the context to make the decision whether in this context this is the right idea. And this kind of combines this idea of an allow list external to the code together with the owner's mechanism that we have, where the owner for the allow list is not the same person who's writing the code, and respectively, you can easily enforce that you get your architect or lead of the platform team type of person to go take a second look and validate that in this case, yes, it's an okay usage. And then again, like this is not like the lint rule where you eventually probably want to get code base and uniform code base. Here, you just ensure that, yes, we did take a look and this is actually what we want to do. Cool. Moving to the final print.
I have a thing I say that's along these lines. It's funny how many of these are like theoisms made more general and arguably more useful. Like this is my reduced dimensions of problems thing. Things that are complex should be removed to the best of your ability. And you don't usually do that just by reducing complexity. It's reducing the number of things that have complexity. An example of like a dimension of complexity is managing your servers, like keeping track of how many servers you're running and making sure enough are running for your users. That's a whole dimension of problems that can be avoided for a lot of applications and developers by adopting serverless tech. If you're using Kubernetes and you don't need to be using Kubernetes, that is a dimension of complexity you're adding to your surface area. And to go back to the velocity point, that absurdly decreases velocity.
Principle here, eliminating systematic complexity. Once again, you're the person who's leading the platform team for your organization, and you're seeing stuff that people struggle with. Every so often, I think it's important to take a step back and make a catalog of what these things that people like struggle with all the time and try to get rid of that problem once and for all by introducing some kind of abstraction that makes it possible to just not worry about it anymore. One, I think, good example for this type of issue is what, at least in big tech, is called version skew. So version skew is something that happens in distributed systems when you have a client and a server, and they're not at the same version. Right?
This is something Malte is really, really into right now. I've talked with him a bunch about the version skew stuff. He hates that it's possible for like your next app serves a page that has JavaScript that says, here's how I get new data. But then you deploy a new backend and it changes where that stuff is. That's a really bad experience because on the client, it's just going to throw weird errors. And now that so much of Next is effectively bound via like index calls to like this route has 14 server actions and 1 through 14 are assigned to these behaviors. But then you had a 15th somewhere in the middle. Everything gets off by 1. If you have your backend in a modern like Next app router app change out under the client after it's loaded, that could cause some very strange behaviors. To Malte, the problem here is specifically that the client and the server aren't tied together tightly enough. So what if you just kept hitting the server from an hour ago, which I'm totally going to hear.
Now, you might say, I'm a front-end engineer. I don't write distributed systems, and you're wrong. Like you're actually doing the hard mode, right? Like because on a data center, you control how things are deployed, right? You know how that works. You can put rules around it. On the other hand, when you have a web client and a server, you're not in control when that web client redeploys, right? User goes to your site, and they might stick around, right? Certainly for like a while. Meanwhile, you redeploy your server. So now you have this hour-old client, new server, and you're introducing a new field in your API, and the client has no idea, right? And so this is a problem that you have to manage now. Now, there's almost like an entire ecosystem around this, like, for example, the Zot library for TypeScript, or the TRPC layer on top of it, which allows you to express rule expectations around your APIs and handle the problem if those expectations aren't met. But that's a lot of complexity, right? There's a lot of stuff you have to like do. And what do you do if you don't get the field, right? Like, what do you actually do?
To be fair, those solutions add a lot of other things, in particular validation of calls that might not be coming from your client. Like if somebody's trying to spam you with things that shouldn't fit, the validation layer and the consistency of the definition layer has value outside of its role as a version that you're hitting. I still have version skew problems with TRPC. It's just that they throw weird looking errors when you're calling from an old client. Like what he's describing here isn't an alternative to TRPC. It actually solves a problem that I still have with TRPC.
It's a hard problem. And so we were seeing this issue at Vercel, and we were wondering, like, can we, again, eliminate the whole systematic problem? And so what we did was we said, hey, we have this serverless product, right? And we don't have like one server with the latest version. We can actually serve other versions of your site than the latest deployment. And so what we have now is a very experimental version, but we were rolling it out over the next weeks, is that you can opt in to a mode in Next.js where the server that response to your client will always be exactly the one version that the client was at, which means you can just forget about this whole problem altogether. It just, you never have to worry about it again. In particular with server actions, which are already like function calls, they're really like function calls now because you actually know which functions you're calling, right?
Yeah, like if you're calling a server action on a different backend than the front end was served from, that's scary. And this helps a lot with that. Oh, did we get a tweet from Malta? Yeah. He just put out articles on this. There's a whole thing to talk about here. Oh, he just shipped it. Cool. Yeah. I could probably do a whole separate video on just this. It's really cool stuff. Malta's a fucking nerd, and this is really cool. So check this out if you haven't and you're curious about all the version skew stuff.
It's not like some abstract version of something named this, but you don't know which one. It's going to be exactly that. And so again, this is just an
Somebody asked a question, doesn't this lead to inconsistencies outside of your server, like your database? Ideally, as soon as something's left your server and gone to your database, it's standardized. But if I switch from UUID to CUID, for example, and I made that switch on my server, I would want to invalidate all old servers. And there's an option to do that. I don't know if he talks about that or not, but if you have a security update or something that isn't backwards compatible past the server, absolutely invalidate all the old ones. And we're going to have to find when and how and build plans around this stuff. It's a very new paradigm. This is one of the weirdest new things Vercel shipped in a while. And there will absolutely be edge cases, but there's a escape hatch of just invalidate old servers and do it the old way that will still exist. But I don't know if I'll be using this feature. This is something I have to think a lot about still.
Example of the type of stuff you can do to make it easier to build applications at scale. Amazing. That's all I had today. This is the whole list. I don't have to go through it again. I think we have Q&A. Maybe it'll be helpful with questions and stuff. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do something controversial. I'm going to skip the Q&A. So if y'all want answers to these, you have to go watch the original. I don't want to steal views from React Summit. I will watch the outro just in case there is more sponsors, so I don't steal their sponsor shoutouts. But if you want to see the answers to Malta's questions here, go watch the original. There's a link to it in the bio. Huge shout out to React Summit. Huge shout out to all of these sponsors. Thank you for getting Malta on for a talk. He has so much to say and doesn't get enough opportunity to do it. This talk was awesome. I really liked it. And y'all should go watch it so you can hear the Q&A at the end there. Appreciate all of y'all. Thank you. That talk was dope. I genuinely really enjoyed that. Malta's been in through the ringer a few times now with giant front-end applications, and I hope this was valuable to you. If you want to learn more about leadership as an engineer and how to keep your teams energized and moving effectively, I have a video all about that pinned in the corner here. Thank you guys as always. Peace, nerds.